Newswatch magazine presents the analysis of world news in the light of Bible prophecy with David J. Smith.
God Almighty said in Ezekiel chapter 33 that someone should watch for the nation, and that someone should warn the nation when they see warfare or something that would come along that would cause the nation to eventually be subjugated. In Revelation chapter 13, it describes a one-world government that's on the rise. It would happen in the last days, in the day of the Lord, leading up to the return of Jesus Christ, in which he would fight this one-world government system that had Lucifer inspiring it. The wrong spirit would be behind it, and therefore they would make war with the saints, according to verse 7 of Revelation 13, and that they would overcome many of the saints. North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms, who was a longtime conservative, traveled to New York City to speak before the Security Council of the United Nations organization. No congressman of the United States had ever spoken before that United Nations organization in its entire 50-plus years of existence. What could have prompted Senator Helms to put his office on the line and buck the political status quo by speaking before the United Nations on January 20th, the year 2000? Does he know something that many Americans do not? Just what did he say to the Security Council that brought no applause whatsoever, no response at all? Was Senator Helms polite and courteous to this organization, or did he expose the real agenda of the United Nations right before the Security Council that they were afraid would come to the American people's attention? Let's find the truth by the statement that he made and the speech that he gave that January 20th, the year 2000. As he entered the room and he was introduced, he spoke and introduced himself and was very polite and courteous toward the audience. He said that he was the first senator to ever appear before the United Nations Security Council. And then he began to tell his real purpose for being there. He said the United Nations needed to be reformed. He said there had to be prospects of an improved United States-United Nations relationship, or else the United States would pull out of that particular organization. He said that this would be the first time that a Senate Foreign Relations Committee member had ever ventured from Washington, D.C. to visit with an international institution. He said that he's hearing from thousands of Americans all across the nation about the United Nations and the people's fear of that organization and the true intent as to what they're trying to do and will eventually do. He said that he is very cautious because ever since he took office in 1972, he's run and always won the election because he was keeping the people of America first and foremost in mind, not an international body. He said that his mail, his faxes, and personal conversations with individuals showed a deep frustration with the United Nations organization. He said the American people know instinctively that the United Nations lives and breathes on the hard-earned money of the American taxpayers, and that we support it with over 25% of the entire budget for this worldwide organization. And yet he went on to tell that organization, its Security Council, that the American people have heard comments in New York constantly calling the United States a deadbeat nation because they wouldn't hurry up and join the United Nations fully and allow it to become a world governing organization. He said they've heard that the United Nations officials were declaring that countries like Fiji and Bangladesh are carrying America's burden in peacekeeping, which is not true. He said that the majority of the members of the United Nations organization routinely vote against America in the General Assembly. And the American people know that. And they're becoming frustrated because of the third and fourth world countries wanting to dictate to the most powerful nation that has brought freedom around the world to more nations than any other peoples has ever attempted to do. He said the American people have read reports of the cheering of United Nations delegates in Rome when United States efforts to amend the International Criminal Court Treaty to protect American soldiers were defeated. He said that Americans have read in the newspapers, despite all the human rights abuses taking place in dictatorships across the globe, that a United Nations special reporter or a person who would give information about a nation to determine whether they were violating human rights, they felt that the United States needed to be investigated more than any other nation on earth for human rights violations. And yet we're the most free country on the face of the earth. While they turned their backs upon Russia, China, North Korea, Cuba, and every other communist country and dictatorship in the world. And he said the American people hear all this, and they don't like it. They're becoming increasingly frustrated with what they feel is a genuine lack of gratitude by the General Assembly of the United Nations organization. He said the United States of America has contributed more than $1.4 billion to the United Nations in assessments and voluntary contributions. That was in 1 year. Then, in addition to that, the American taxpayers also spent an additional $8,779,000 from the United States military budget, instead of building up our own military to protect us from foreign invaders. They used part of our military budget to carry on the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations around the world. And that was over $8,779,000,000 in addition to the $1.4 billion of the regular assessment of the United Nations. So that was a total in the year 1999 for over $10 billion that we gave to that organization. No other nation on earth has ever even come close to matching that singular investment in any organization, much less the United Nations. And yet the United Nations routinely votes against everything that is America, everything that has to do with freedom, everything that has to do with the Constitution of the United States to guarantee our rights as a free-loving people. And then he went on to tell that Security Council, the 15 members of it, that the United Nations, it's reported, does not respect the sovereignty of the United States. And yet every member nation of the United Nations is supposed to be a sovereign nation. That's why back in the 1980s he went on to say that Congress began withholding a fraction of the money that they were to give to the United Nations until they made reforms. And those reforms have always been incomplete. And he went on to tell that august organization, quote, "Now I'm afraid that this law does not sit well with some here in the United Nations. It's a law that was voted on by the Senate 98-1, that they would mandate the United Nations to make the reforms or else they would pull out of the United Nations." He said that many people in the United Nations did not like the reforms that were dictated to by the United States Congress in order for them to stay in the organization. Some have even suggested that the United Nations reject these reforms. And he said if they are rejected, there will be a lack of funds coming if he has anything to do with it. He said the United States and the United Nations relationship is being harmed greatly by the very reasons that he has already mentioned to the Security Council of the United Nations. He said that 80 years ago, Woodrow Wilson failed to secure congressional support for United States entry into the League of Nations. And that was because he wanted to make the League of Nations a world government, and the United States would lose its sovereignty and its freedom, which has been given to us since the inception of this nation in 1789. He said that Woodrow Wilson probably could have achieved entrance into the League of Nations, except he had 14 points that he felt were absolutely necessary, and he wanted to cram it down the American people's throat, especially the Congress. And they wouldn't have anything to do with it because it would have lost the freedom of America. And so he said that he, as a senator of the United States, would make sure the people were protected first and foremost in everything. There would be no one, as long as he was on the Senate committees and the Foreign Relations Committee, that would allow the United Nations to overtake and supersede the authority of the United States government and the Constitution that protected its people. He said that he did not want the United Nations and the United States to have a rift. He wanted it recognized by the United Nations that they would respect the interest of the United States. And he said, let's be crystal clear and totally honest with each other. All of us want a more effective United Nations, but if the United Nations is to be effective, it must be an institution that is needed by the great democratic powers of the world. And he said that most Americans do not regard the United Nations as an end in itself for any type of world government. To be exact, the opposite. The United States was founded by people that wanted to have self-rule, not some global authority dictating to them what to do. He said the American people want the United Nations to serve the purpose for which it was designed to begin with. They want it to help other sovereign states coordinate collective action by coalitions of the willing states to provide a forum where diplomats can meet and have open channels of communications in times of crisis. They do not want the United Nations to become an all-powerful world government that will dictate to the United States of America. And yet this is exactly what the Alabama State Legislature, way back in 1962 to 1964, determined that the United Nations was founded for. It was to be an assault upon the Constitution of the United States of America. Then Mr. Jesse Helms went on in his speech before those 15 security members, council members. He said the United Nations has a core work, and the United States can work with it. If in the coming century the United Nations forces or focuses on doing these core tasks well, then the United States people will support it. But he said, if the United Nations seeks to move beyond these core tasks of peacekeeping and an open form of communication, if it seeks to impose the United Nations power and authority over nation states, he said that he guaranteed that the United Nations will meet stiff resistance from the American people. I'll break into his thought. More and more people in America are understanding that the United Nations was designed to impose its will upon every nation on earth. To be exact, in Revelation 13, it says in verse 4 that this government that is rising, this beast that's coming up out of all peoples, languages, and nations on earth, and the only thing that meets the description of that is the United Nations organization. And therefore, this all-powerful military that's mentioned in verse 4 that no nation will be able to stand up against, he said the American people will resist it. America, that means if Senator Helms is correct, eventually there is going to be war in America. There is eventually going to be resistance by the American people not to lose their freedom. And if this occurs, those people high in government who are delivering the American people into international slavery at the hands of the United Nations will allow United Nations troops to come onto the shores of America. To be exact, September 12th, 2001, a phone call came to me personally from someone in Orlando, Florida, and said that he was at a phone booth standing there watching United Nations troops in this country, but he had no camera to take the picture. And so America, it's going to happen. Senator Helms went on and spoke very bluntly to the Security Council. He said, as matters stand, many Americans sense that the United Nations has greater ambitions than simply being an efficient deliverer of humanitarian aid, than being a more efficient peacekeeper, a better weapons inspector, and a more effective tool of great power diplomacy. He said that the American people see the United Nations aspiring to establish itself as the central authority of a new international order of global laws and global governance, which means government. This is an international order the American people will not countenance, or, in other words, they will not stand for it. They will resist it. And he went on and spoke to that august council, and he said the United Nations must respect national sovereignty. I will interrupt once again. Kofi Annan stated publicly before a UN meeting that it was time to cross sovereign nations' borders, to put down any type of military action that might be planned by an individual nation, and that the United Nations organization needs to lay aside the concept of sovereignty. This was the Secretary General of the United Nations. He said the United Nations serves the nation states that are members of it, not the other way around. There's not to be an august, powerful group at the very top that dominates power at the United Nations and dictates to the nation states of the world. The principle is central to the legitimacy and ultimate survival of the United Nations. And this principle that the United Nations should serve the nation states and not the other way around must be protected at all cost. The Secretary General, he said, recently delivered an address on sovereignty to the General Assembly, in which he declared, and I'm quote, that the last right of states cannot and must not be the right to enslave, persecute, and torture their own citizens, end of quote. The peoples of the world, he said, have rights beyond borders, end of quote. What the Secretary General calls rights beyond borders, we in America call inalienable rights. We're endowed with these inalienable rights as Thomas Jefferson proclaimed in our Declaration of Independence, not by kings or despots, but by our Creator. Jesse Helms was a witness to the Security Council of the United Nations that there is a Creator God and that He is the one that is sovereign. He went on to say in this speech, the sovereignty of nations must be respected, but nations derive their sovereignty, their legitimacy, from the consent of the governed. And that's the way it originally was written into the Constitution of the United States of America. America, those times have changed. It is not the consent of the government anymore. It's executive orders. It's presidential decision directives that are handed down that changes the legitimacy of the Constitution so that it will open us up to laws by the United Nations superseding the Constitution of the United States. Mr. Jesse Helms went on and said that in none of the cases in recent history have there been an opportunity for the United Nations to superimpose itself on other nations lawfully. He said that totalitarian dictatorships are the ones that are creating the problems in the world. And yes, there comes a time when the United Nations has had to go in and offer peacekeeping legitimacy. But he said that there is an inalienable right, God-given rights, and the United Nations has no power to grant or decline legitimacy to such actions if the United States wants to go to war by itself against an aggressor nation. He says these rights of a sovereign nation are inherently legitimate. He went on to show that the American people will never accept claims of the United Nations to be the sole source of legitimacy of the use of force in the world. No, the United States was to remain a sovereign nation no matter what the United Nations organization said. Then I want to get away from his speech just for a moment to remind our audience that in July of the year 2001, the United Nations had an 11-day meeting in which they discussed disarming the world, private citizens, the military of the world, and that all military would come under a United Nations world police force, and that no nation on earth would be able to stand up against it. And when you disarm people, then that means they have no way to resist tyranny being imposed upon them. The last rule of communist revolution states that under some pretext they would pass laws and with an end point in view to confiscate all private firearms from the citizens. If this is the communist rules for revolution, then if the United Nations is trying to implement that rule, doesn't that mean that the United Nations organization is designed to be a communist world? Sure it does. Everything the United Nations does is nothing more than the planks of the Communist Manifesto. The redistribution of the wealth of the world from the have nations to the have not nations. An international bank where they loan to countries in the third and fourth world, and then they have to follow certain directives first. And when those directives are not followed, then they can't borrow any more money. And they can't go to private institutions because their credit is gone with the International Monetary Fund of the United Nations. So the nation becomes worse off, and it becomes a dictatorship by the United Nations over those third and fourth world countries. And that's exactly what they want to do in America. But Jesse Helms, senator from North Carolina, also heads up the Foreign Relations Committee, said that no organization, even the United Nations, holds authority over the United States. He said that no treaty or law can ever supersede the one document that all Americans hold sacred, the United States Constitution. And yet the Alabama legislature in 1962 to 64 had a retired military colonel, Archibald Roberts, come and speak before that legislative body. And they started an investigation and came to the conclusion that the very sole purpose of the United Nations was to create an assault upon the Constitution of the United States, to erode it and institute in its place an all-powerful world government. Jesse Helms was very correct. The Bible does say this world government is rising in Revelation chapter 13, verse 1 to 7 very clearly. But then when you read verse 11 to 18, you'll find that there will be an economic system also in which they're eventually going to enslave the world, and that nobody will be able to be allowed to be a part of the economic system to feed your family and to have a house to live in unless you take this mark of the beast. This numbering system that guarantees you the right to buy and sell, so they can track you and know where you are every moment of every day and know where you are within 10 feet at all times. Yes, America, you need to be repenting on your knees before your God, because this world system is coming.